Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Slightly Off Axis podcast, where we explore the history of space science and exploration through the stories of those who made it possible. Today's episode features Scott Vangen, Mike Haddad, Byron Bonds, and last but certainly not least, Maynette Smith. And I want to open the show and apologize to Byron because I misspelled his name on all the publications that I created. Our guest worked leading up to 1990 on Astro 1 and leading up to 1995 on Astro 2, which both flew on Space Shuttle Columbia and Space Shuttle Endeavour, respectively. And so I'm going to change cameras to the camera that has me looking at you, and I'm going to welcome Scott Vangen, Maynette Smith,
Hey.
and via microphone in his car, Mike Haddad. And Byron will join us as soon as he can.
Hello, everyone.
And I'm going to take that little ticker out as soon as I remember where that ticker is. Okay. So the Astro Restoration Project is an all-volunteer group of current and retired NASA engineers, contractors, and civilians restoring Space Shuttle, Space Lab Astro 1 and Astro 2. And rather than go into all of that myself, I'm going to let our wonderful guests do that. So who wants to start?
I guess I'll kick it off. On behalf of our team, Mikey, Maynette, and Byron, and many other volunteers on the Astro Restoration team. Ken, we thank you for inviting us to this podcast. We're delighted to be here. It's another opportunity to do an outreach and inform people that may not be aware that this restoration project is underway and has been for the last couple of years up in Huntsville, Alabama at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. We have a partnership with them in addition to a partnership with the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and several supporters, private industry, individuals, collegiate, and other organizations that are enabling us to do this. We, amongst ourselves, will share with you today a little bit about the project, of course, but also how we got into this. All of us are aerospace engineers with varying backgrounds, but the one common thread we all have is that we worked the Space Lab program. The Space Lab program was a very successful international partnership between NASA and the European Space Agency that started in the early 80s with launching scientific platforms, both pressurized and unpressurized scientific packages with the associated crews on various space science discipline missions over about a 2-decade period. About 24 plus missions were flown on Space Lab, each having a unique story and portfolio in and of itself, but the ones that we're focusing on is the Astro series, Astro being short for astronomy, and as the name directly suggests and is rightly correct, it is a dedicated UV astronomy platform that flew 2 very successful missions, both in 1990 and 95, as you said in your opening remarks. So let me stop with that and pass the baton on to, I guess, Maynette next, and we'll kind of set the stage for how we got into this. And, over the course of the next hour or so, we hopefully will give you an idea of why we think this is significant. Also, where we're current status and our future plans, and if people are so interested and inclined, how they can support or be directly involved with. Maynette, would you like to go next, please?
Sure. I'm kind of the new kid on the block. Byron and Mike and Scott have been working this in its previous form before we were officially the Astro Restoration Project. Had been working, saving this hardware and keeping it in storage. And I think it was, October 2020 when we Finally got an agreement with the U.S. Space and Rocket Center and officially became the Astro Restoration Project in November of 2020. They very kindly lent us their support to start the restoration of the Astro Cruciform. We became incorporated in October of 2021, officially as the Astro Restoration Project, and became a 501c nonprofit in January of this year. So, and our focus really is using the Astro restoration as a mechanism for STEM education for the next generations.
Which is wonderful. I just want to pause you for a moment and remind you that when I need to show the slides to let me know.
Oh, okay. My involvement with Astro was very limited. Actually, I was involved with Astro Zero as a data processing engineer. Astro was initially supposed to fly in March of 1986 to view Comet Halley. And because of the Challenger accident, it of course got remanifested and did not fly until 1990. So its mission, the science, what they were looking at kind of changed since they did not have Halley's Comet. So I worked as a data processing engineer at that point. By the time Astro 1 came, I was actually in a different position and was very peripherally involved with Astro. But Scott and Byron and Mikey were involved with both missions. And I'm going to hand it off to Byron and let him talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, Byron, welcome to the broadcast. I hope we've worked out your technical issues. Seems like we hear you.
We'll see. How do you read me?
We hear you. We see you.
Oh, very good. And I see Scott's video has joined. At least it did momentarily. So I think Maynette was handing the talking stick to me around the 1997-98 time frame, where we were looking at capturing hardware as it was being the mission peculiar hardware as it was being accessed by the government after end of mission in the Astro series. So we had hardware that was captured at KSC area excess hardware auctions. And we also had hardware that we recovered in the Huntsville market that had been shipped back to Marshall Space Flight Center. Even before we were working on the Astro collection, there was an effort to preserve other hardware associated with Space Lab, including the module. So we actually have some hardware that predates the ARP effort that was integrated into a module before it left KSC and went to the National Air and Space Museum. So Scott, are you with us audio and video now?
I'm on board, Byron, and I think we're just kind of doing the initial baton passing, handing like we said, and let's see if we can bring in Mikey to introduce himself and how he got involved. And then, Ken, I would suggest we can bring up the Astro Restoration Project elevator pitch charts after Mikey's done, and we all can walk through that together. Mikey?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Mike Haddad. Yeah, I was basically I worked the Astro missions from the mechanical side, installing hardware, cabling, electronic boxes. And as Maynette mentioned, we call Astro Zero, which is supposed to fly in March of '86. She said one of the experiments was to view Halley's Comet. And that was the one experiment that I was responsible basically installing and cabling up, which was called the wide field camera. When that mission got canceled because of Challenger, they pulled that experiment. So basically, the one that I was kind of prime on from a mechanical standpoint got pulled. But kind of worked the missions from there, and it was mostly together. So we just had to kind of do some tweaks between the flights. But getting involved in the project, I know Scotty and Byron and a number of other people were involved in preserving this hardware, basically save this stuff from being destroyed. And when they told me about, hey, we're looking like we're going to try to put this back together, it was a dream come true. And basically, we're using the same procedures we used in the 80s. We're going to use now in 2020, 2021, 2022. So when they said, hey, we're gonna put Astro back together, I was 100% on board, and I've been there ever since. So that's kind of my angle on it.
Okay. I'd like to remind the audience that you can ask questions in chat. If you can't figure out how to do that, you could also do it other ways. I've got a phone number if you're calling from the United States, so I will put that up on the screen. You could use this phone number to talk to me. You could leave me a message to say what you want to ask a question about, or you could send me an email at this email address in case, you're watching, but you're not actually signed up for the platform you're watching on. So with that, are we moving to the elevator presentation?
Yes, please. If that's
okay.
Straightforward for you to do.
So we'll do that. Click, click, click. A few clicks and we'll get there. Looks like it's in the thing. I just need to do the bounce here.
There you go.
So,
well, if it's okay with you, Ken, we'll walk through the charts and likewise kind of hand the baton between the four of us. And what you see on the cover chart there is a pretty picture of the Astro payload. And to set the stage, I mean, what's remarkable from the word go is this is the largest space telescope assembly that flew as an attached payload to the space shuttle that flew 2 missions and returned to Earth. And that's something unique I'm hoping the audience will take away. As amazing, spectacular, and unprecedented as the Hubble Space Telescope and the James Webb Telescope is, and the other great observatories, Astro is unique in that it flew and came back. And that's what makes for us, and we believe the U.S. Space and Rocket Center and the Smithsonian very interested, is it's the one scientific astronomy mission that civilians, the public, can see the actual telescopes in person that flew in space. And there's a human element of that. Of course, when people go to museums, there's a distinction between seeing a mock-up, a model, a picture, a simulation, a movie, and it's quite another when you actually see the flight hardware. And so, as Byron mentioned earlier when he introduced himself, when the space program came to an end, we were keen in trying to preserve as much of this hardware as we could, knowing at some point in time we would come back together and make a run at our partnerships with the Smithsonian and the U.S. Space and Rocket Center and making this a public display. And that dream is now a reality and happening. Next chart, please.
Okay, let's see how well I can shuttle this thing.
Maynette, do you want to go ahead and introduce a little bit about who we are and what kind of volunteer base we have?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned previously, we became a 501c nonprofit this year. We're an all-volunteer organization. We, of course, promoting STEM through the restoration and preservation of the Astro payload. We've got a team that encompasses all aspects of the initial Astro missions. They include flight crew astronauts, the original science teams. You've got people that were involved in the design of the Astro payload, fabrication, the integration and test at KSC, the launch and landing operations, as well as the on-orbit activities. So we've really got a broad base of knowledge and experience to, to restore and put back together Astro in almost original condition, but also to engage with the public, engage with students to help them understand and learn about not only the technical details of Astro and the science of what it did, but the personal experiences that each of the people working on the project, what they experienced, what they carry with them, what their memories are. So it really has become a labor of love for our team to bring this back to life. And basically what we have at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center is a living exhibit where we're actually doing the restoration activities, installation activities, and the public can watch that. And we've had a lot of folks when I've been there, they've come by and asked a lot of questions, and we're very interested. So, and that's very, exciting for us to be able to share our story.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Maynette. Let's go to the next chart, please. And Byron, if you can, you want to talk to us and share with the audience a little bit about Space Lab and the Astro missions, please?
Hey, Byron, you're muted.
Unmute, please.
Muted. Oh, thank you. The Space Lab was a joint venture between NASA and ESA and involved pressurized payloads inside the modules and also unpressurized payloads that flew so they could take direct observations of the space environment from the cargo bay. So Astro is the latter category. It was an observation telescope assembly, and it consisted of the 3 telescopes and then some pointing hardware that was used in keeping all the telescopes co-aligned on the appropriate targets during the mission. So I believe I worked 21 Space Lab missions in my time with the program, and I was at KSC for 17 of them. So it certainly was multiple missions as prime payloads on the space shuttle. The Space Labs were not partial payloads or getaway specials or mid-deck payloads. They involved entire modules that took up the entire mass and volume of the cargo bay and most of the resources of the crew as well as the vehicle. And Astro was no different. It was a dedicated mission. It did have one other payload that flew with it, and there were other not major payloads that flew mid-deck, certainly. But Astro was a prime example of Space Lab. It really challenged all the systems and capabilities of the vehicle, of the crew, and of the entire program, including the hardware.
It's wonderful. There's a lot listed on this page. Does the document actually get to that? Do you actually explain all these different labs, or is that something that you'd have to attend a long talk for?
We are focusing our conversation today on the Astro missions. The Space Lab series, as Byron and Maynette both mentioned, nearly, if not over 24 missions. And in fact, Mike Haddad recently has written a book on the history of the Space Lab program as seen through the people who did the assembly, integration, and test. And maybe that's a good segue for Mikey, since he's on the road and not seen these charts. Mikey, do you want to carry on the conversation about Space Lab, kind of big picture, before we dive into Astro, please?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it was an amazing project, the Space Lab series of payloads, because you did have that international effort. So we worked with people from basically all over the world, and kind of the way it worked was each of the individual experiments or multiple experiments would have their point of origin, could be anywhere on the planet, and then they would kind of all come together there at Kennedy. And kind of our job from mine from kind of the mechanical standpoint was to mechanically get the hardware installed and either on one of the pallets that was for the unpressurized part of the Space Lab program, large U-shaped structures that basically expose everything to the vacuum of space, or the hardware would go inside the pressurized modules. And so all the hardware would come from all over the planet, and our job was kind of mechanically to put that thing together. And then, of course, Bryon helped with, he was major in the design, and any problems we would have, Bryon have to go out and help us fix those problems. And then, of course, Scott and Maynette were responsible for testing all that hardware. So you figure some of the missions, and I'll just use Space Lab 1 as an example, had over 70 plus experiments on one mission that came from all over the world. And our job was basically put all that hardware together and make sure everything worked and talked to each other before it flew. So that was kind of our piece of making that happen. A lot of this hardware, of course, came from, again, scientists, universities, other space programs, the Japanese space program, European space program, all those. And of course, came with that was the whole international aspect of understanding the differences and the processes and how things are a little different depending on how each country does their space program. I'll just give you just one quick example and then let it go from that. It was like the Japanese. When we worked at Japanese, we would, one of our first meetings, we'd get down, we start asking them questions, and they'd say yes. And okay, next question, they'd say yes. And then next question, they'd say yes. We thought, oh, this is going really good. You know, they're answering all our questions yes. But then we found out later in their culture, yes means they understand the question, not yes to the question. Okay, so we had to make sure. Okay, so yes to the question. So then, of course, they would congregate and discuss it, and then come back with an answer after that. And that was just one example of the things we learned working with international partners. Because again, that really had never been done before. Of course, space stations international, but Space Lab was kind of the real first piece of us working with other space agencies and scientists and engineers and of a space lab, and and all that planning and all that had to kind of come together down there at Kennedy, and of course all the people that supported that to make that happen, not just us but everybody that was part of that team and support team and people, of course, supporting missions and post-flight work. So that's kind of a big picture of space.
Thanks, Mikey. You're kind of cutting out at the end there. Just to let you know.
And it was over a couple, and of course from them. That was about it. That was I was going to talk about how the ramifications of that. Went on to professional papers, people getting PhDs and stuff. So that was about it for me.
Okay, so if the viewers had trouble hearing that, what Mike basically said when the audio was becoming a little bit hard to discern was that Space Lab, as flown here through the Astro missions, was the first time that U.S. worked with international partners, and they learned that the Japanese would say yes to answer any question which they understood the question and not necessarily yes an affirmative answer, and so they had to learn that. He also then brought us to a place where we're going to continue with either Scott or Maynette or Bryon. So back to the team.
Yeah, Ken, thank you. And thanks, Mikey. If you can go to the next chart, let's dive into now the Astro mission. And we'll start with the hardware. As mentioned earlier, it's a telescope platform. And I think most people are familiar in telescopes, and in their basic operating principles, they're no different than the telescope you probably had as a child or even as an adult. It uses a combination of eyepieces, optics, and electronics as detectors to take in the ultraviolet astronomy photons and convert them then to usable data for the scientists to discern the various aspects of the components that they're researching on, whether that be planets, stars, galaxies, nebulas, whatever the case may be. There was 3 ultraviolet telescopes that flew, and in this cartoon graphic, in no particular order, the upper left-hand corner, the Hopkins Ultraviolet Telescope, also affectionately known as HUT, was the largest of the 3 telescopes. It was about a 1 meter diameter primary mirror. It's quite large. In fact, till just recently, that was on display at the National Air and Space Museum at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., in their Planetary Sciences Museum exhibit hall. It has been removed, per plan, as part of the updated restoration that's going on in the National Mall that maybe some of you are aware of. But more of interest to us, it's also been removed and being now prepped to ship to us at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, for integration onto the platform with the other telescopes. The one with the square-looking top is called WHOOPI, and that's really how you pronounce it. It's an acronym, Wisconsin Ultraviolet Photopolarimeter Experiment. It's from the University of Wisconsin, and that telescope is a spectrometer, similarly to the HUT telescope, which, by the way, is from Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. The difference being the Hopkins Ultraviolet Telescope is a single spectrometer with amazing sensitivity in the UV band of interest. The WHOOPI telescope has a pair of spectrometers that look at light from a polarization perspective, somewhat along the same principle of what your polarized sunglasses work. Light can get blocked one direction or the other, 90 degrees apart, and there's scientific information that can be extrapolated from that. The third, and certainly not least, is the ultraviolet imaging telescope. That's from the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. That is the pretty picture telescope. Everyone likes to see pictures, and spectrometers, although fascinating to scientists, do not contain a lot of content for the public. But the UIT instrument produced high-resolution ultraviolet images. It used photomultiplier tubes to convert the ultraviolet light into visible light that could be extrapolated and put onto film, conventional film, large format film, and that film was processed and developed upon return to Earth. So those three telescopes, along with a complement of other instruments, were all bolted to an assembly called the cruciform. And the cruciform simply is because when it looks from the top, it looks like a big T. And think of it as a quadrant with 4 bays, and the 3 telescopes were in their own bays, and the 4th bay was used for an optical sensor package, which helped with the alignment of the instruments to stay on lock with the targets. And here's the amazing thing for the people listening. All of these telescopes on this platform, as Bryon mentioned earlier, was attached to an instrument pointing system that was made by the Germans, Dornier Systems. And that pointing system had a resolution on the order of about 1 arc second. Now, what does that mean to people? Well, I think most people know what 1 degree is. There's 360 degrees. If you look at a circle, 1 degree. Well, 1/60th of that degree is 1 arc minute. 1/60th of that is 1 arc second. And so what does that mean? Well, these 3 telescopes, along with the other complementary instruments on there, were all co-aligned that when the instrument pointing system got on lock, would stay with the precision of the equivalent of about trying to keep think of it as a bore sight of a optic at about a mile distance a dime. So resolve a dime at a mile, and that's kind of the precision that you're talking about with these telescopes. And this is on a space shuttle that's orbiting 17,500 miles an hour, a couple hundred miles up in space. So the technology for all of this is late 70s. While the shuttle was being developed, Space Lab was being developed in parallel with the Europeans. And so there's an appreciation, if you're a technologist, that over 50 years ago, the technology allowed us to have this high resolution optical system mounted in the space shuttle that could fly multiple missions and return this high quality science. The rest of the complement of the instruments that you see on there shows how that whole assembly then mounted into pallets that fit within the space shuttle, and the avionics that controlled that from the Space Lab system perspective. All of these components that you're looking on this chart, we have access to with just a few exceptions. And that's the interesting thing I go back to again. Our intent is to restore the full Astro configuration, starting with that cruciform with the telescopes that's underway in the Smithsonian, or pardon me, the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. And then when we deliver to the Smithsonian, we wish and hope to augment that with the pallet train, the instrument pointing system, amongst other things. So let me pause right there, and Maynette or Bryon, do you want to take a run at a summary of the 2 Astro missions on the next chart, please?
I think you all are better equipped to do that than I am, so I'll pass it off.
Bryon?
I'm getting unmuted. Well, the Astro payload complement flew 2 missions, and the first one was in 1990, and the second was in 1995. And these were limited by the crew members and by orbiter fuel, etc. The science instruments themselves did not pose any kind of limitations on how long we could gather observations. So these were very compressed missions. There were primary targets, secondary targets, and wow, if we're really lucky, list of targets. And they said the crew and the ground worked 24/7 for the entire duration of the missions, capturing, tracking, overcoming issues, technical issues, and gathering the science data. I don't know the number of publications that were updated, the number of papers that were written. While it looks like only a few hundred observations compared with a 20-year mission or a 30-year mission of a Hubble or some other Class A instrument, this was only limited. Astro was only limited by the vehicle and the crew's resources, and that still gathered an amazing amount of data. I don't know how many years they worked on, the scientists worked on reducing the data and doing publications based on what they gathered in Astro 1 and Astro 2.
Nicely summarized, Byron. And if I can add one story, and there's many of them, one of the reasons Hut is in the Smithsonian is it tells the story that the principal investigator, Art Davidson, his principal interest in flying Hut was to get a measurement of something called the helium abundance ratio. And what does that mean to us civilians? Well, it has to do with still the hypothesis of the Big Bang and how the universe expanded, is that if the model that scientists were thinking is in fact correct, there should be a certain ratio of hydrogen and helium that from the early formation, a very specific number. You start with a hypothesis, you have a model, then you have instruments to try to verify it. Well, between the Astro 1 mission and more specifically the Astro 2 mission, they used distant galaxies as a candlestick, if you will, to look back, billions of years in time to the early era of our universe's formation. And with that spectrum I described earlier, they built up the time evidence that showed that the model and the actual measurement were dead on. And if you're a scientist, there's nothing that feels better than your hypothesis matches the model, which means that your original thinking on that particular scientific instrument our principle is correct. It put another kind of confirmation in place with the Big Bang that was not there prior to Hut. And that's how science works. You build off of the shoulders of giants, as they say. Each instrument complements its own, but that's one story from Astro that I think is unique, that I was there during the unveiling of the data to the public at a huge science convention that was in Pittsburgh several years ago. But during the mission itself, you could see the smile on Art Davidson get bigger and bigger as the days went on, because he knew what he was seeing, but of course he couldn't reveal that till he crunched the numbers. So if you like, Maynette, you want to set the stage for the next chart, which is how we kind of went from a successful scientific missions to turning into space archaeologists and at the end of the Space Lab program, please.
Yeah, this is really, this has been decades in the making. The final Astro mission, as was mentioned, was in 1995. And the Space Lab program ended in 1998 to make way for Space Station. And all those assets associated with Space Lab were dispersed. Some went to the Space Station program, some went back to other centers, and then some were disposed of. It was mentioned earlier, things like the cruciform were found at salvage yards and other places and were recovered by basically some interested NASA and contractor personnel like Bryon and Scott and Mikey. And a lot of that hardware sat in storage for quite a while for Astro. And it wasn't until 2020 where, we got the go-ahead from the U.S. Space and Rocket Center that said we could have some space to start the restoration efforts, and partnered with them. Those assets like the cruciform, which had been in storage for like 20 years, were moved. The cruciform itself, there was a lot of cleaning and restoration that had to go on with that. We found stuff. I won't go into the stuff that was found while they were cleaning it. In the 2021 timeframe, we finished the restoration of the cruciform itself. It was moved into the atrium of the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. And this year we got last year the Whoopi telescope was transferred from the University of Wisconsin's museum, the Space Place, down to the Space and Rocket Center, and was installed in February of this year. And as Scott has mentioned, we are currently waiting on the ultraviolet imaging telescope and the Hopkins ultraviolet telescope, and we're hoping we get them, before the end of the year, early next year. So you can see that this is kind of, folks have been working on this for a long time to make it a reality. And so we're very excited about the fact that, we are partnering with a number of folks. We've had a lot of support to get this to happen. And, it's reality. So if people get a chance and are in the Huntsville area, we highly encourage you to come in to the U.S. Space and Rocket Center and see the Space and Rocket Center itself, which is a fantastic museum, but also the project itself.
Okay. I hope the audience could hear what Maynette was saying. Obviously, if something was not easily discernible, please ask questions and we can reiterate those points. I think it was pretty easy to hear what she was saying, but always the internet is playing a game with us. So we work around these features and we push on.
Well, thanks, Maynette. Thanks, Ken. Say, Bryon, care to elaborate a story or two on where we find excess hardware? I think that might be of interest to the public and something they probably don't typically associate with NASA in the disposition of flight hardware.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. I guess one of mine recovery stories, some of the stuff came through regular auctions and we caught it. Where the team was there, we had representatives there, they had the right amount of money in their pocket to take care of a deal, and some items we missed. In one case, there was a piece of hardware that was sold with a bunch of, and this was flown hardware that's currently reintegrated on Astro today. But it was sold with some non-flight tooling at Marshall Space Flight Center, excess there, and was bought by a gentleman that had no interest in flown hardware or museum displays. He was retrofitting and re-outfitting and selling ovens, vacuum bake systems, etc. And he was an electronics engineer, so he really couldn't care less about a 200-pound piece of hardware laying in a batch of hardware that he purchased. So I was doing business with him, trying to horse trade for other Astro items, and went to his warehouse. And on the way out of his warehouse, I walked by a piece of hardware that was in a briar patch. It was on the ground, and I inquired about it. I knew what it was. And I said, hey, what are you doing with this laying out here? And he said, well, it was too heavy for me to throw in the dumpster. So it's on the ground now, and if you want it, you can have it. Well, it turns out it's the OSP mount plate, one of a kind. And as Scott has said before, there's probably 3 people on the planet that would have recognized that piece of hardware laying in the bottom of a briar patch. And one of them just happened to walk by that day trying to horse trade for some other hardware. So all it took for me was to bring a large enough person, which I went and recruited my high school age son, to help me load it in the back of the pickup truck. And I think that maybe for me, at least personally, the most peculiar piece of hardware that we rescued in the restoration of the Astro payload. And that was OSP in the briar patch. And I thank George Hodges for his contribution to the program.
You have an audience reaction from Jolie who says, wow, very cool.
Well, go ahead, Bryon, and share the cruciform story. You talked a 200-pound, now talk a 3,000-pound find.
Oh, yes. Well, the cruciform, I was at work at Kennedy Space Center. Scott was in Huntsville supporting space station, U.S. lab development. And my phone rings and there's a guy on the other end, and he's kind of animated. He's yelling at me. He says, "Hey, they're throwing the cruciform away. What are you thinking, throwing away the cruciform?" Well, I'm 700 miles from Huntsville, and my response was, "What are you talking about, and who is this?" Well, it turned out it was a design engineer from Teledyne Brown named Rick Howard, and he'd spotted the damaged crate at an excess auction in Huntsville. And so I immediately I queried him, what do you see inside the crate? What's the markings? And I had all the part numbers and stuff memorized. So I was able to vet that he was actually looking at the cruciform. So as soon as I could get him off the phone, I hung up. He told me it's already on the back of a truck with a scrap dealer, a local scrap dealer, and they're going to go cut it up and sell it as scrap metal. So I immediately got off the phone with him, made a few notes. I think I wrote down 5 names and started dialing numbers to try to find somebody in the Huntsville area. And somebody gave me Scott's number wherever he was at work in Huntsville. I don't know exactly where he was. And I call Scott and I'm yelling, "Hey, somebody's throwing the cruciform away. You gotta get up, go take care of it." And I think Scott said something along the lines of, "What are you talking about? And who is this?" So we were within hours of losing the cruciform, the central structure of this piece of hardware, except for someone seeing it and saying, "Hey, that may be a little too precious to throw away," calling me, getting me stirred up, and then me calling Scott. And he was able to arrange to leave work long enough to go and wheel and deal with a local scrap metal dealer and save the cruciform, surely within a day of it having been permanently destroyed and turned into whatever you make out of scrap aluminum when you recycle it. So that was probably the closest call we had that we recovered from, was losing the entire cruciform.
Wow.
Is that the story you had in mind, Scott?
Yeah, I sure did, Byron. And that was a key seed and a key story, because had this cruciform not been salvaged, this would all be academic. As Byron said, it's the backbone that holds everything, and I mean everything, on the observatory platform. And when we had that tucked away, we knew we had a fighting chance, because the 3 telescopes had been returned to their principal investigators. We knew the telescopes were safe, but this mission peculiar hardware, no one had a foreseeable need for it because it was dedicated to Astro. And so when Byron and his contacts worked the cruciform, the OSP was saved from a similar salvage story. Avionics was found at scrap metal places. We saw that the pieces were coming together, and what started with, "Hey, maybe we can pull this off," to, "Hey, this is meant to be." We tucked it away, stored for decades, and then as enough of us retired, apologies to Byron, he's still working, we had the manpower and people power, forgive me, for getting the restoration underway. And maybe that's a good place, Ken, with your permission, to allow Mikey to jump in and talk about some of the restoration work that was required on that cruciform and the mechanical structures to get the instruments installed. You still with us, Mikey?
Yeah, sure am, and hopefully my audio stick. Can you guys hear me okay?
It's a little choppy.
Okay, Scotty?
It's a pretty marginal, Mikey.
How about that? Is that any better?
No, it's a little marginal.
How about that? Any better?
It's very choppy. Maybe you can move to a different location along the route and get to a better place.
Yeah, but I actually pulled over, so let me get to a place here. I'll be right.
Okay, well, we'll get back to Mike when we get to a better signal for him, and we'll move on, I guess.
Yeah, Ken, again, with your permission, why don't we segue into kind of, we'll come back to the hardware aspect, but there's another important component to this. In fact, we didn't know it at the time, and that was putting the Astro payload back together opened up opportunities for education and outreach. And I think Maynette is in the best position as our education and outreach point of contact to tell you what kind of plans we have in place, and it's exciting. I've nicknamed it, and I think others, as Astro 3. Its new mission as we restore this, as it will continue to inspire future generations. Maynette, can you kind of walk us into that? And I think page 8 is a good segue, Ken, for you with the charts, if you would be so kind.
Okay, if I can figure out which one is page 8. I think we were on about page 6, weren't we?
Yeah, I think it's the help future generations.
Help inspire future generations.
Yeah.
It might be in a different presentation.
Actually, it's page 9, I think.
Because it
You've
looks
got
like
some.
I came to the end of that one, so
It should be go back 3, and you should have it. And I'll kind of start talking a little bit.
I've come to the end of that part, so I'm going to check the other pages.
Okay. Well, I'll keep talking. Scott, after I say something, I'd like you to talk a little bit about NASA Hunch, you and Bryon. Our nonprofit was formed on the basis of being able to use the Astro restoration effort as a project to engage young people in the interests of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And what we're doing right now is we're actually applying for a National Science Foundation grant that is looking at the Astro exhibit and using it as a way to gather data about how people are actually interpreting what is being put out there, what are the barriers to learning about scientific efforts. And we are engaging the University of North Alabama, who has an agreement with the Space and Rocket Center. Their contact that we're working with on this NSF proposal deals with oral history and communication. And so we're trying to meld the humanities side with the technical side. And out of this proposal, we're hoping to get some data on what are the barriers to learning and how can we generate curricula in an informal learning environment to help engender interest in STEM and its subjects and better understanding of in this case, astronomy and what it means in the bigger picture. And this hopefully will be a pathfinder for additional ways to help the Space and Rocket Center to tell their story and make it, more cohesive so people understand each exhibit in the Space and Rocket Center and its context in the bigger picture of space history.
Oh, nice. Thanks, Maynette. And Bryon, per Maynette's request, I think you're in a great position to talk about Hunch. You brought us on board with them, and if I need to do a little plug, I think Bryon is the most networked, connected man I know in the aerospace program. So when we started this, a lot of key people and partnerships were facilitated by his knowledge, and this is a good example. Bryon?
Well, I guess I know 6 people, Scott, and it just turns out it's the right 6 people. Best connected maybe for Astro restoration. The Hunch program, I don't know the origins of it. It's probably been around 15 years. It started, I think, with one high school in the Huntsville area. It's the acronym for High Schools United with NASA to create hardware. And one of the 2 founders of the Hunch program, Bob Zeke, was working at Teledyne Brown at Marshall Space Flight Center developing mock-ups. And they used the Hunch as a vehicle to get hardware built, generally training hardware and mock-up hardware by the high school students. And they expanded capability and added schools. And I think there's somewhere north of 200 high schools across the country now that do everything from culinary arts. It's specifically for creating menus and food items for astronauts to the actual production of stowage containers and the crew transfer bags, flight hardware. So these guys they have come in the 20 years engaging the students and expanding this program, and it has been it's a tremendous success for STEM on behalf of the nation, using space as the teaser to get the high school students interested in it. So I asked Zeke if he was interested in coming and talking to the program, told him we had some hardware items that were missing in action that we might need to build some replacements. And he came out, was enthusiastic. Mike and Scott were able to give him the right kind of drawings, got him turned on to the right materials. We made a few trades to keep from having the cost quite as expensive as it was in the first round. And these guys showed up on the day that we were, well, a few days before, to Fit Check Hardware. When we got ready to install the instruments, all of the mounts and hardware that these high school students created fit perfectly. And they were, I'll let Scott or Mikey talk to the details of which items they manufactured, but you know what we could say here is the first mission in Astro 3 is a relative huge success in the fact that it actually has high school kids manufacturing hardware that interfaces with flown hardware and will be in museums for decades to come.
Nicely summarized, Byron. And Mikey, I see you got 3 bars. Can you follow up with Byron there and talk about some of the hunch hardware that was fabricated that enabled you as the lead mechanical to integrate Whoopee in the OSP?
Sure. How's that? Is that any better signal?
Yes, it is.
Is that better? Yeah. Yeah. Again, a lot of the hardware has been around for decades. There's, like was mentioned before, some things we still have, we found. Other things were gone. One thing that was very helpful too was was drawings. We were able to actually contact the P. Marshall, who we were able to actually, going back, we had a friend of ours had the original drawing tree from Astro from the night. She had saved it over 30 years. And what a drawing tree is, basically talks about every drawing that makes up that mission. So we had basically all the drawing numbers associated with all the hardware that flew. And from there, then we could say, okay, well, we got the numbers. Where do we have the drawings? Well, the people at Marshall in the electronic database still had those drawings in the database for 30 years. And so we were able to access those drawings, the ones we needed, and to get able to, put the hardware back together, and especially now what we talked about for building. A couple of things that I'll just see Whoopee telescope was we had the cruciform, okay, but we didn't have the brackets to connect you together. Those were gone, vanished. And so using the drawings that we had in the early 80s and stuff, was to give those drawings to the Hutch people. They fabricated those brackets into, me personally, they looked like flight hardware. They did an amazing job. Like Byron says, this hardware that they're fabricating, themselves to try to match up the stuff that's in space. We put that hardware on. Basically, one set of brackets went on scope, one set of brackets went on cruciform, and there was a bolt basically that would go through. There's actually 3 locations that hold all that together. The brackets went perfectly on Whoopee, the bracket perfectly on the cruciform, and the bolts themselves work perfectly. And all done by these kids. Just amazing work. And it was just one piece of how something that went there. We had the drawing, we had their knowledge and expertise on building things, and it all came together. And that's the only way we were able to get basically Whoopee installed to this today. So yeah, I mean, they do amazing work, and of course there's some future work that we've got going on now. Other things that have basically vanished, they're gone over the course of all these years, that now they're going to help us fabricate to continue the project. So hope that came through okay.
Thanks, Mikey. Yeah, a little bit of distortion, but we got your message, and we understand the constraints with tying you in mobile. So Ken, we want to follow your lead at this point. We can pause for questions from the audience.
Well, we're going to go back for the page 8 because I've got the right document. Maynette has sent it along to me. So we're going to go back to that page. Excuse me, page 8. So I'm going to add that to the stream. So that's what we have right now.
Yes, and this is where we're segueing, and Maynette set the stage for this, is that because we are a 501c3 and we're an all-volunteer group, we rely on the help of partnerships and supporters, both from the team and externally. And we have been told by people knowledgeable that we are probably the single largest private spacecraft restoration effort underway on the planet right now. And we're proud of that. If for no other reason, we like to rise to challenges. Keep in mind, when all of us that you hear from today, amongst many others, a cast of hundreds, if not thousands, were involved with the original Astro program. And for us to get this back reintegrated and set for museum quality display is a fraction of people. We have about 24 volunteers, and we rely on support. And at the end of this presentation, we hope we can put up the last chart, which has our website and a place for people to donate. And donations are certainly acceptable and encouraged. The costs associated with things can get immense. Shipping alone ends up being thousands of dollars. The fabrication of hardware, although our partnership with Hunch, the work itself is free. The materials, stainless steel, amongst other things, and special tooling does cost money. This program will happen, and whether that be entirely internally funded and or with the external partnerships, that's basically the intent of this, is that it's more than a museum piece. It's for me, I stated it earlier, it's the largest flown scientific instrument package from an astronomy perspective that will be on display on the planet. And we think that's unique and worthy of the attention that we're putting to that. And that wasn't planned. Again, things like this happen because individuals kind of had the foresight that this was something important. It's, as Maynette said, it's a labor of love, and that's entirely true. I think you go to any museum and you can almost throw a rock at any piece. I don't encourage you to do that, of course, but the point being is that almost anything in a museum has a story and how it got there, and very seldom does it go directly from its use directly in the museum. It takes this odd path, and ours, as we've been sharing with you today, is disbanded individual pieces that have come back now together through the efforts of the Astro Restoration Project. Maynette, do you want to compliment anything further on that, or segue to chart 9? There's a picture of the Hunch folks and also Mikey working with some teenagers.
Yeah, so the help that we're getting is of course, as Scott mentioned, the actual restoration itself, but the other part of it is developing materials that are STEM oriented and outreach materials to basically, we're gearing toward, school age, but at the same time, we also have products that are really for all ages. So helping us develop that curricula and those products are another part of the project as well. And if you want to segue to page 10,
Okay.
This shows a good part of the team along with some of our supporters. This was in February when we installed, well, before we installed Whoopi, who was sitting there behind us. And we're, in addition to looking for support, monetarily or through sponsorships, we also are looking for volunteers, and if we have folks out there that are had worked spaceflight hardware and would like to participate, we highly encourage them, and there's a way to sign up on our website. And not only if they want to do restoration, but if they want to help us develop grants or develop the educational and outreach materials to help with fundraising, we really would encourage and welcome the support.
Okay. Now ready to go to the next slide?
Yes, please. Okay. Scott, do you want to take it on here?
Well, yeah, I think at this point, Ken, the four of us have given you and your audience, we hope, an overview of the Astro Restoration Project, Space Lab, specifically the Astro science missions, and what they were about, and then our efforts for bringing the instruments back together and preserving them not only as a museum artifact, but as we've communicated, for a leverage for its third mission, and that is for STEM and outreach and inspiration for future generations. And I think maybe it's a good place to pause if you have any questions, or your audience, and we'll try to respond accordingly. And if people want further details about the restoration, we can dive into that other package. But I think here's a good place for you to steer the ship where you want to take it.
Okay, if the audience has questions, obviously you can ask them now. We've got a small audience of 6 people, 3 people on YouTube, 2 on Facebook, and 1 on Twitch. So if you want to ask questions now, and obviously if you're viewing this later, you have questions, you didn't get to participate live, leave us a comment in the social media. Leave us a comment on Twitter. Go to the email address. I'll put that up again. So let me find the banner for that. Email address for me is follows, kenotto21@yahoo.com. Or you can call this number and leave a message if you're in the United States, or text it. So 772-210-4555. Yeah, if you got comments right now, go ahead with those. I'm seeing an error on my comments, so I'm going to quickly look at another device just to see if comments are coming in, and I'm having an error in my software. But very impressive, I have to say. As a person who has been running this podcast, I'm going to have to go back and watch again just to learn everything from the presentation, because the distraction of running the podcast makes it impossible for me to pay attention as much as I would like. Looking, I'm not seeing any real comments on YouTube. I will check out the other platforms real quick and just see if anybody's commenting there. Joey says, okay, good, it is popping. Jolie has a comment, so I'll read her comment. She says, thanks so much, all of you. This has been very interesting. Would love to check out the website. So I'll leave the website up there. It's www.astrorestorationproject.org, or you can email them at info@astrorestorationproject.org. So I'll leave that up there for a while. I think it's been up there, but obviously if you want to see that again, please let us know in chat. And I'll put everybody's picture up so they can be seen. And if Mikey is out there and has stopped, we can maybe see Mikey on screen, but he was driving and he didn't want us to see his chin all day. So, but there's Mike. So, I'll see what Mike looks like. I'm going to quickly check out Facebook and see if we have anything. Turn my sound down so we don't get an echo. I'd like to thank both Astro Restoration Project and Teledyne Brown Engineering for promoting today's podcast. So I hope that helps more people to see that. I really appreciate the podcast promotion. It's been great talking to all of you. I really, as I said, wish I could have completely focused on the show. If I had somebody else to run this show, it would make that much easier. But it's just wonderful to start off the season 2 with such a wonderful group of guests who have such a wonderful and viable program to actually restore an object that's actually flown in space and come back. So it's just exciting, to me.
Ken, can we go around the horn for closing comments? If people,
and I also have another viewer comment from Victoria Guerreri. Enjoyed listening to this information. Thank you. Yes, please do go around.
In no particular order, Mikey, since we see your pretty mugshot there, any closing comments?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Does that come through? Okay. Yeah, just closing comments. Thank you for everybody that's watching and the interest that you have in this project. Of course, it's near and dear to us, and it's continuing. It's going to be going on for a number of years, and I'm just looking forward to all the fun in the future, finishing the project. And
so I think we heard most of what he said. He said thank you to everyone who has been watching, and he's going to pour a lot of information out about the project. Is that what he said? Correct me if I'm wrong, Scott.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the final comment was there, actually.
The Internet of Things is being unkind today.
Maynette, any closing comments?
I just wanted to thank you, Ken, for having us, and thank everybody that was listening today or might be listening in the future. Like I said, I'm the new kid on the block. I was kind of peripherally involved with Astro, and I've learned so much from these guys, and I'm really grateful to be part of this effort because it really is, it's exciting and gratifying. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great to have you. As I recall, it was you, Maynette, who actually reached out to me when I created the podcast about a year ago. And or I reached out to you. I don't remember for sure. It's been so long. So many things have happened in that year span. But you could correct me if I'm wrong.
I think you reached out to me, and then we kind of connected up from there. So
yeah, I might have gotten your name from someone else. I might have gotten your name from my first guest or my second guest, because those ladies were very helpful in getting the word around, and there were some other people that encouraged me to do this in the first place that made it possible. So yeah.
Well, thank you.
Good to have the team on. So I'm not seeing any comments, questions. I think the information was so good that people just don't know what to ask.
Byron, any final words?
Yes, thank you, Scott. I was just thinking, over the course of a career, even an entire lifetime, we have a lot of cool things we get to do that are great this year and great next year, and people might even talk about it or have a reunion 5 years later. It is very rare to be associated with an organization, with colleagues that puts together something that is preserved for history. I mean, Scott said some things that are pretty unique about ARP, but to me it is that in my career, I've never put anything together that's going to outlive me in the National Air and Space Museum. And I think all of the combined efforts it has been a joy to work on this, to have like-minded people that are hard-charging, successful in their own right, and intended to see this thing through. And Ken, I want to thank you for hosting us today, because you let us talk about probably one of the highlights of our careers, even though for most of us it's post-career. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Well, there were a couple of questions that I used to ask last season, and since we do have a few more minutes, if y'all have a few minutes time, maybe I can ask some of those questions since we've gotten into the full presentation. How do you feel about that?
I'm okay, sure.
Okay, so Mike is coming back. I'll wait till he either adjusts his camera or turns his camera off again. So I'll see whether he wants to adjust his camera. He's waving at me. Maybe I'll bring him in and let him wave. Okay. So Mike, you just got back. I just got through telling the team that there were a few more questions that I would have asked last season. And so I'm going to turn on the side camera so that I can look, and I'll scroll that down. Because last season, the show was all often about things that, were just me off the top asking questions of people who worked in any aspect of the space program, why they chose their careers and so on. So around the panel, did you have a career in space before Astro 1 and 2, or was this your initial career?
Boy, all four of us can probably wax eloquently on on that story.
So maybe instead of going into full detail, just say how many years did you spend in space career before Astro 1?
Well, sure. I'll start it off. I started in '82, Ken, and really abbreviating my story, I was one of those kids that grew up with the beginning nation space program, and so watching the Gemini and Apollo missions as a kid and doing my share of Estes rockets, knew that I wanted to get a career with NASA, and went into engineering. And people who know me know that the story was I was only going to work for NASA. So I turned down other offers and held firm and started at the Kennedy Space Center in the fall of '82. And also people know me, I had my astronaut pursuits. In fact, something I didn't share with you, I guess, till now, is that I was the backup crew member for the Astro 2 mission. The Astro flew payload specialists, which are non-career NASA astronauts. And I had the opportunity to be the alternate payload specialist for Astro 2. And had there been an Astro 3 mission, which was on the books for a short time, I would have gone into a flight rotation. And so for me, it's personal on a lot of different bases, but also I was trained for about a year and a half to fly as an astronaut for Astro, had I been asked to do so if the primary crew couldn't go. So Bryon, I think, touched on it. And, none of us, when we started our Astro careers, our space careers, thought at some point we're going to be working on an archive of the hardware we worked on in a preservation mode. But I couldn't be happier and how that kind of played out. And it's a fitting end. And even end isn't the right word. It's a fitting continuation, another chapter in preserving our space history. So that's my story. I had 37 years with NASA, all spectacular, but Astro holds a special place in my heart.
And if the team members don't want to answer that question, I did skim over the information you sent me, and I noted that something in that information hinted that there are things that are, among the things that you're doing with the youth and the experiments that you're fostering now, something is going on Artemis, and I'm not sure when and what mission, but something is going on Artemis, correct? That you're helping to foster with these other agencies that you work with to help youth do science projects that end up in space? Or am I wrong? Did I read that incorrectly?
Oh, I think what you're reading about is we do have the postcards to space that we designed some Astro postcards that can be sent to Blue Origin that flies them on their rockets. So yeah, that's kind of, we had talked with, it's called Club for the Future that Blue Origin has, and they do the postcards to space program, and So we're tied into that loosely. And we offer that capability for kids to download the postcards. They're all Astro postcards and can send them in so they can be launched.
Okay, so there is something there. I maybe have read more into it just by reading the names that were included, that you were supporting these different NASA initiatives. So that's why I asked the question. Did you want to answer the question, all of you, as Scott did, or do you want to move on to another question? Did you want to answer your work history question, or should we move on to a different question for each person?
I think I would suggest the work history, because everybody's got a little bit of a different story about why they came and all that. I can.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Your audio is cutting out on you.
You want to go next?
We're going to have to get you back on our show again, Mike, at a time when you're in a place with better cell service. Because I've heard you on Stay Curious, the other podcast that's airing about this time of day, and we need to get you back on this podcast so that we can, hear what you're saying, as opposed to having the 5G or 4G cut everything you're saying into little bits. So sorry about that. Maynette, did you want to continue?
Sure. Yeah, I came to NASA right out of college in June of '83. So I came a little bit after Scott. I'm also a child of the 60s. I watched, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon sitting on my dad's lap at 8 years of age. And my dad was an engineer. I'd always wanted to be one. And I also was a big Star Trek fan. So space was kind of the thing. So, when I got, to be a senior in college and NASA was doing an interview, that's where I wanted to work as well. And ended up in the same work area that Scott was in. And it was a great opportunity for NASA folks to do hands-on work, integrating, testing, experiments. And when I came, they were just processing Space Lab 1. I think they'd gone into the level 3-2 processing. I spent 33 years with NASA before I retired, the whole time at Kennedy Space Center, but in different capacities. And it was a fantastic experience. I met a ton of amazing people from all over the world, and from corporate as well as academia. So it's this Astro Restoration project is continuing that in a different way, and it's great.
Okay. And in the private chat, I told Mike he could call me on my cell phone if he wants to make a cell phone call, and then we could hear from him without all of the digital breakup that the internet is providing for him today. So, Byron, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ken. Astro was the second mission that I was assigned to work. And I started on it at Marshall Space Flight Center, I think building 4708, if there's anybody around that's old enough to remember that. And Teledyne at the time was the prime integration contractor for Marshall Space Flight Center. So I had opportunity to work on 2 missions at the same time, Astro being the second one. And then I actually went to Kennedy to not to work on Astro, but to integrate a different mission. And then after the loss of Challenger, I rotated in permanently at the KSC office, and then Astro came back around. So I hadn't planned on seeing it or doing integration work on it at KSC, but it came back around in the second or third year that I was there, and I was worked on it until it had flown 2 missions and been deintegrated.
Okay. I'm waiting to see if Mike calls in. I haven't seen him call, so he's probably working on that. So if he does, we'll talk to Mike. But I gave him my number so that he could call me. So we kind of did that. There's something in here about Space Lab 1 on STS-9. So I think we kind of discussed all of that. So here's Mike calling in. So let's go back to Mike. Hi, Mike. We've got you on the phone. Yeah, that's better.
Excellent.
So go ahead, Mike.
You want me to go ahead and talk?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, when I got involved, I was a little kid. I actually was born in Cleveland, moved down to a small town called Titusville, right across the river from Kennedy Space Center. And from the point I was 9 years old, I pointed over there and says, "That's where I'm going to work. That's where I want to work, and that's the only place I wanted to work." And so, of course, as I grew up, went through college and all that, and graduated. And actually, I co-opted at the Space Center for STS-1. So I was a kid in college, sitting in there was a room off of the firing room for STS-1. Of course, I was hooked by then. And then when I graduated in '82, I went to work permanently in the same group that Scott and Maynette kind of worked in, the hands-on group. So it was in my blood since I was a kid. And then, of course, once we got involved with the science and all that, it just kind of took off. So I basically started in '79 as a college kid at Kennedy Space Center, and then graduated in '82. So that was kind of where I came from. Like I say, I've been in space not my whole life, and then I basically worked out at Kennedy for 32 years. I bounced between different groups out there, different payload groups at Kennedy, but spent 32 years out there. So basically, was there for STS-1. Saw the last shuttle launch in July 2011, and then I retired in December 2011. But of course, now you're still involved in kind of other aspects of the space program. But of course, the most beneficial one is the Astro restoration project. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you so much for your background, Mike. So I'm just going to ask, at this point, we're at 1 hour and 24 minutes. I want to ask, is the team, got anything critical that they need to work on, or does somebody need to get to, another destination at a specific time? Because we're kind of within the time frame that Scott allotted for the show. What's your feeling on that as a team?
Well, my thoughts are I think we've told our story, and unless there's any specific follow-up questions, probably free up the people to start their weekend. I can be overridden on that, but I think, I know that you both.
He's calling back.
I was going to say.
Yes, Mike.
Sorry about that. I hit the wrong button.
That's okay. We were just asking the team if anybody wanted to continue or if it was time to adjourn. Because we're kind of at the point that Scott and I had agreed on, the length of the show. And since we're not really seeing any questions from the audience, it probably would be a good time for everybody to go. Do you agree, sir?
That's fine. Yeah. I mean, I'm okay if you need to stand longer, but yeah, the team, like you say, if it's coming to an end, that's fine. Yeah.
So Scott has said yes, he's ready to go. Bryon and Maynette, what are your feelings?
Well, I'm kind of like Scott. I think we've told our story. If people have questions, they can contact us at the contact info. And again, really appreciate the time you've given to us, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Same for you, Bryon.
Yes.
So thank you all so much. My guest today is Scott Vangen, Maynette Smith, Bryon Bonds, and sometimes with technical issues, but on the phone. But thank you very much, Mike Haddad. Great to have all of you on Slightly Off Axis podcast. Let me go back and get the website link. It's right there.
While he's doing that,
So
thank you, Ken, on behalf
www. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just saying on behalf of our team, thank you, Ken, for allowing us to come and share our story with you. And maybe a year's time from now, if we're invited back, we'll give you an update. Hopefully some more exciting things, the Hutton UIT integration, some more things with the STEM outreach, and who knows what action will have happened in a year's time. So thank you, sir.
Okay, you're welcome. And www.astro, A-S-T-R-O, restoration, R-E-S-T-O-R-A-T-I-O-N, project, project.org. That's where you go to find out more about this lovely organization and all of the things that they do to restore the work that they created for NASA all those years ago. And I'm going to run the show close. And obviously, folks, if you're watching and you think of something that you wanted to ask them, get in contact with the show through the social media on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and we have a Twitter account as well. Use the email address or phone number. I'm looking just to make sure that we have a little bit. Bryon says, I might want to broadcast from USSRC during next big integration event. Where is USSRC?
Huntsville.
Huntsville, okay. Okay. Well, you guys could remote in from that, or I could set something up if it's a good date for me to actually go there. All of this is portable. It just need good internet access to make it work. So we could see about that. We'll see what happens. I'm excited. I thank you all for doing this on the day that Artemis rolled back out on the pad. That's kind of fortuitous. Might get some more eyes on this broadcast. And cheers to all of you. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much. And we'll be in touch about that broadcast in a year. So here comes the show close. And I think, Byron, I think I misspelled your name, but I might have got it right. I don't know. I looked at the email, so we'll find out all together.